Good morning. Today is Tuesday, June 22nd, the 12th of Tammuz, Yud Beis Tammuz. We're studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Meseches Shabbos, chapter 6, Nun Ches Amud Aleph, 58a. And today, with Hashem's help, we'll turn the page to 58b. We're talking about the kinds of items that can be worn on Shabbos outside. Are we concerned about them being removed and carried? Or are there other concerns on Shabbos? And we've also, through our discussion, woven in and out of other people carrying stuff, because we quoted Braitot to discuss and to interpret certain items in the Mishnah. And so along the way, we end up discussing how there are restrictions of garments that can be worn on people, regular folks, Jewish folks, and there's also restrictions, as we discussed last chapter, with the one's livestock, and we'll see some of that discussed in quoted Braitot. And we'll also see that occasionally there is a restriction, a prohibition, about what a servant, slave, or a person on the staff can wear on Shabbos. We started yesterday with talking about these badges, as I was referring to them, or these kind of seals, or logos that would indicate who these people were connected to and working for. And we're going to do a little more of that discussion today. Just before we start, I want to point out today is a special day on the Hasidic calendar. Today is the 12th of Tammuz, and that is the birthday of the previous Rebbe. But more importantly, or more famously, it is the day that the previous Rebbe was released from imprisonment by the Soviets, who arrested him because for, I think, 7 years. When was the revolution? Was it in 20 or 19? But anyways, for 7-8 years, he had been resisting the Soviet Union's attempt to shut down all types of Jewish education and continuity. Those that know the history know that the Soviets shut down thousands of shuls and schools and mikvahs. And the previous Rebbe was quite defiant and insisting that, and he mobilized all of his students and anyone that would heed his voice, including Jews from other I don't want to use the word denominations, but other groups of Jews living in the former Soviet Union, and he mobilized whoever would listen to resist and to continue teaching Torah, and they brought all these efforts underground, and it was quite an operation. And they arrested countless tens of hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals involved in these efforts. Many were killed by the Soviets for the terrible crime of, I think they called it, it was subversion of the state, crimes against the state, because of course the state religion was not religion. Actually, one of the individuals who died as a result of these purges and or seeking out those that were Soviet, treason, committed treason against the state, were my wife's great. Great-great-grandfather was actually shot, faced a firing squad as a result of his work for the previous Rebbe. And for many years they didn't know his fate, and they knew that they figured he was gone, but they only found out many years later when the archives opened after the fall of the Soviet Union. They found out that he was actually shot not long after he was arrested. Anyways, it was a great miracle that the previous Rebbe escaped, and he was able to continue this fight in the Soviet Union, as well as across Europe, and then eventually he comes to America, and we've discussed on other occasions where he built up what eventually became the network of yeshivas and educational institutes and Chabad houses that were spearheaded by the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory, his son-in-law. So with that, let us start learning our Gemara. I'm going to share the screen, and we'll get started. I will add, though, that tonight we're going to have yeshiva night like every Tuesday night. 7:45 Mincha Ma'ariv, and then we'll have a barbecue and learning, and it'll be dedicated as well for a special day. And I want to add that we're learning today Lili Nishmas, Aaron ben Moshe. So we'll have him in mind with our learning, as well as a prayer for healing and good news for all of Klal Yisrael. Before we, or as we start, I want to show you something interesting. The Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch has a siman called Shin Daled, which ironically is an overview about the laws and the relationship of a slave and a servant and their owner. This is not at all us condoning or promoting slavery, but to know the halachas as they're presented. And I believe reading this text from the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, from Rabbi Yosef Karo, will help our Gemara a little bit. I'm going to hit mute all just because there's some noise in the background, and feel free to unmute for comments, questions, and the like. So here is the Code of Jewish Law, Shulchan Aruch Shin Daled. What is the deal with servants and the laws of Shabbos observance? So he says, and we'll go through this fast. A person is commanded that his servant not work on Shabbos. This we see in the Ten Commandments. Which kind of servant? Shemol v'tovo l'shem avdos. A servant that was circumcised and went to mikvah for the purpose of being a slave. As we know, there are different kinds of slaves in the temple in biblical law. There was an Eved Ivri who was already Jewish, but there was also a person that maybe was captured in battle. And again, not here to defend slavery, but to point out that if you lost in battle, you were a slave, and if you were victorious, the person that wanted to enslave you might have become a slave. And there was also markets for slaves. Just to know what the facts of the matter were, there are halachas about how you have to treat your Eved Kenani. And an Eved Kenani had rights beyond, I believe, what other slaves in the ancient world had. And they would be, when they were induced into the service of their master, they would also have to have a circumcision and go to mikvah. And they had many laws of Jews. They were Jewish in many regards. And once they were freed, they would become entirely Jewish in every regards. But had they not been circumcised and gone to mikvah, and had they not gone through this partial conversion, and they simply accepted to observe the 7 Noahide laws, such an individual is not like a Jew, and therefore they're allowed to desecrate the Shabbos laws for themselves. But they're not allowed to desecrate Shabbos in the service of their boss. And similarly, a Jew may not instruct this individual who is under the authority of a Jew, but not obligated to observe the laws of Shabbos. You cannot request of him to do any malacha, even if you are not his boss. Now, let's say he didn't accept anything. He's just a regular Gentile. Basically, then he's considered a Gentile where you treat the laws, and there are certain instances where one is permitted to instruct a Gentile to do certain things based on, we'll see in the coming many coming days of the Gemara, that there are certain occasions where you might be able to ask a Gentile beyond asking a Jew. And similarly, when a person, God forbid, passes away on the first day of Yontif, the halacha is the Yisasku by Amamin. Their halacha is on occasion that you could have a Gentile handle the body, prepare it for burial, and so this person but this slave is not considered such an Eved. Asr laim al Eved Yisrael, afilu Eved alilim, to keep in the Meleches Eved Asr min HaTorah, because there is a special prohibition for a Jew who has a servant or slave to desecrate Shabbos, lihutra b'davar she'ein bo pikuach nefesh. Okay, long story short, there are some nuanced differences in the status of a Jewish slave, but what is the same across the board is that they are not allowed to desecrate Shabbos at all for the purpose of their master or their owner, even if they are allowed for their own convenience to desecrate Shabbos. A conventional Eved Kenani, however, would not be allowed to desecrate Shabbos even on their own, because as we mentioned, the conventional form of an Eved Kenani, they are already considered Jewish, and they have to be treated as such for a mitzvah saseh, she'ein hazman grama, any mitzvah that's not time contingent, they are obligated to observe. Others disagree, but I just wanted to give you that little flavor of what we're talking about. Others disagree and say that there are those that say that until the Eved Kenani comes onto the side of Torah observance, they may be allowed to do any kind of desecration. All right, maybe that adds some context to what we're talking about, maybe not, but I wanted to share that with you. All right, now let's see the Gemara. Any questions or comments real briefly before we jump in?
Yes.
Go
What
ahead.
relevance does this have for today vis-a-vis relationships between employers who are Jewish and employees who are not Jewish?
I believe very little. Very little. Except in the sense that one cannot instruct a Gentile who will listen to their voice to desecrate Shabbos for them. But I believe there is no commonality in the status of the relationship between a Jewish boss, let's say, and a Gentile worker. However, and again, this is not my specialty, but I am under the impression that there may have been instances of Jewish people having slaves in the times past where slave ownership existed. And it sounds strange to me, but I remember hearing or seeing an article or that there were people, maybe of the South, but I don't really think of the South. I think really of other countries, maybe back in Europe where there were slaves, that they would treat them as an Eved Kenani, and maybe they did toivel them and give them a circumcision, and maybe they were considered Jewish in a way that we can't really fathom because we can't fathom slavery at all today. But certainly there is no such relationship, to my knowledge, that exists in our modern day world here, and I think we should keep it that way. I hope I answered the question, but
Dr. Yeah, but I think it's a really nuanced thing, which we could talk about some other time, which has to do with like your ownership of, let's say, stock in a company which has stores that are open on Shabbos, blah, 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 blah. So we won't go there now.
Oh, I hear you. In other words, you're saying there are other situations where something that you own may or may not be required to ensure that it doesn't work on Shabbos. Okay, that's a good point. I think it's a slightly different,
right?
But it's connected and it's interesting. And I guess the other thing that is shameful to mention, but I'm going to mention it anyways, is that we know that in China, for example, you have the Uyghurs that apparently are being treated in really, really terrible, despicable ways, and many of them are being held as slaves, as well as other people in China. And it makes one wonder, now that we're talking about this, what kind of relationship are you allowed to have with a business that takes advantage or uses such labor? But I don't think that's really a Shabbos issue, because I don't think anyone would claim they are your slave. But I think it is the ethical issue of the day, and it's kind of strange that there isn't a greater outcry. And certainly talking about it on a small Zoom call for the Gemara Shir doesn't really cut it. But I think it's important to keep that in the center of our attention. Reb Beryl.
Bernie, it gets even more complicated, because if you have shares in a company, are you an owner?
Well, as I've told you, I own one single share of Disney, and they treat me, well, they don't treat me like a bitch.
Right.
But I get all the notices, and I get all the.
Right, you could vote for the board, and you could, right.
Cost them more for the paperwork than the shares were.
It's exactly what I think every time I get a notice in the mail. All right, let's see the Gemara. Gufa, Amar Shmuel. So this is the text that we just read previously, but now we're going to analyze it in its own. Amar Shmuel taught. A person that has a slave that's commanded to observe, and he's commanded to ensure that his slave is not desecrating the Shabbos. They can yet go out, he can go around town with a seal, a badge, indicating his affiliation and his connection to his owner. But they may not go around if they have a similar type stamp, seal, badge, if it's in their clothing. So I'm imagining around the neck means around with some kind of like necklace or chain. And on the clothing is probably, like, think of the undercover cops that have the badges on there, they flip it out, versus if it's on the garment. So a slave may go out if it's around the neck, but not if it's attached to their clothing. Let's see Rashi. The fact that it's made out of tit, mud, we're not really worried about it. I think this is actually meant to be a little later. All right. Anyways, so Shmuel teaches that a servant has it around the neck. They can walk outside, but not on their clothing. And Tanya Nami Hachi, indeed, we also have a brisa that confirms this. A slave can wear this seal around the neck, but not on their clothing. Okay. Sounds very straightforward and simple until we find that there are other texts that don't exactly support the same idea. They seem to be a contradiction. And of course, one of the things the Gemara does frequently is we'll find two contradictory texts and find a way to synthesize and make them both make sense by understanding that they're talking about slightly different scenarios. So let's see the Gemara do that now. Viraminu. There is apparently a contradiction because we've taught in another brisa. We would have been taught in another brisa. Lo yetze ha'eved v'choisam shevet tzava, right? There's a brisa that says a slave may not walk outside in the public domain with such a seal either around their neck or on their clothing. Which, how does that contradict the previously read brisa? The previous brisa says you're allowed to have it around your neck. And here it says, Lo yetze ha'eved v'choisam shevet tzava, a slave may not go out with this badge, stamp, seal on his neck. And there's more halachas. Such a seal is not able to become impure because it's not considered a keli. The laws of purity apply to a vessel, but this little round badge kind of thingy is not able to become impure. Additionally, a servant, a slave, I think that's what we're talking about, should not walk around outside with a bell around his neck. But he may walk around with such a bell connected to his clothing. And this bell, regardless of how it is connected, can become impure because it is not a tashit. It's not something that decorates you up. Rather, it is a keli, a vessel that does something. Namely, it makes that noise. So this text seems to be a contradiction. Can a slave wear his seal around his neck or not?
Rabbi?
Yes.
I thought we were on Shabbos, we weren't supposed to make clap or sing, or clap or play musical instruments, except if it's in a nigun or something like that.
So you're asking a very good question. You're asking, when are you allowed to have any kind of sound-making device on Shabbos?
Right.
The Gemara is going to ask that question in a few lines. So good question. Thank you. Let's keep an eye for that. The Gemara is going to discuss it in a slightly different context, but I think it might answer our question as well. The text continues. Similarly, an animal can also not go outside on Shabbos without a kind of a seal that maybe is occasionally attached to an animal. By the way, just consider this. In certain regions, terribly, they would brand livestock, and terribly, they would brand human slaves. So in that sense, obviously, a chaysam would be considered an upgrade. I'm sure anyone would prefer to have some kind of stamp than branding, and obviously we prefer to have neither, but just to keep it all in context. So an animal may not wear this seal, nor a chaysam in its clothing. And as soon as I read that word, I had the question that you're wondering. I don't usually see animals wearing clothing, although there is a dog on Ocean Drive that walks around with really cute little shoes and a nice little sweater. Maybe you've seen it. Let's see what Rashi says. What's ksusa? Horses have a certain garment that they wear, or something that's put on to keep them clean. So an animal cannot wear this seal if it's attached to the clothing.
Like a tattoo?
I'm sorry?
Branding would be similar to a tattoo, would be yes, sir?
No, well, branding is literally burning the flesh of a...
Right, but it's sort of like a tattoo also. It's a permanent...
It's like a tattoo, but it's worse. Imagine the pain that it inflicts.
Wouldn't that be not allowed by the Torah then? They do.
I don't know. I don't think it's an issue of a tattoo.
I mean an animal.
I don't think it's an issue of a tattoo. I think it's more an issue of tsar, of causing pain to God's creatures. But I may be wrong. I don't recall seeing a discussion about branding, although I'm sure it's somewhere. The nor may an animal go out with a bell if it's connected to its clothing, nor a bell on its neck. And such bells do not become impure. Rashi, like Teitze, what's wrong with a bell? So Rashi reminds us that not long ago we saw the mechzi keman de oz lechinga. Even if the bell doesn't ring, it still looks like they're being brought to the market. And ein mekabel tuma, why don't they become impure? The ein tachsha de behema, because there's no such thing as an adornment for an animal. It's going to have some other function that's not to benefit the animal, but more to benefit the ownership. Let's read Rabbi Steinsaltz here for a moment. He says the same thing in more words. Because animal ornaments and utensils do not fall into the category of objects that can become ritually impure. And apparently it is even prohibited for a slave to, okay, and this is the final line, which I already shared with you. Apparently it's even prohibited for a slave to go out with a seal around his neck, contradictory to Shmuel's opinion and contradictory to the brisa which supports Shmuel's opinion. So how do we resolve two brisas? One brisa that says a slave can wear a seal on his neck, and one that says they cannot. So the Gemara has its first attempted resolution. Ready for this? Lema, here is a proposal. Say like this: Ha the avad le rabbe. We'll use our old distinction. If the boss made him wear it, well then he should not wear it on Shabbos, because if it falls off. Okay, let's use Rabbi Steinsaltz's explanation. I like it better than, there are different ways of understanding this, but let's use what he says. What's the deal? When the master makes you wear it around your neck, he's going to be afraid to remove it and carry it. He's going to keep it on his neck exactly the way his boss wants. However, when he made it for himself, well then, there's no law compelling him to wear it, and he might carry it, and therefore you cannot carry it. So that's the first proposed answer between two texts about a slave wearing it around his neck and not. Who remembers why a slave might want to have such a badge if his boss didn't make him wear it? So we mentioned yesterday that sometimes belonging to the right boss could equal some kind of heightened protection. So, protexia, right?
I imagine being a slave to somebody important gave him status.
Probably. Or at the very least, no one wanted to mess with his stuff. And so it gave protection at the very least. All right, so that's the first answer. And the Gemara rejects it. Loy. No, that can't be the answer. Idi v'idi da'avad le'rabeh. Both brisas that say that a slave can or can't, contradicting. If a slave is allowed to wear such a thing around his neck, it's talking about that his boss made him wear it. Although when we were studying the Mishnah, and we had an opinion, the opinion of Shmuel, I believe, who says that the word kabul means the stamp of a slave. And the Mishnah said that it was the stamp that he made himself. That is the way we interpreted it yesterday. Over there we said that it was made out of mud. If it breaks, we said no one's worried about it, that he's going to carry it. The Avad Le'Rabbe will have a mitzar, the Choz Mash Lenifsak, Le Shakal Matzavar, Mishum Imsa D'Rabbe. Anyways, the Gemara had a reason. It was easier, or it was acceptable to give that answer there, but it's not going to work over here. So let's see how the Gemara resolves these two brises. Kan b'shel mateches, the kan b'shel tit. The whole distinction is what kind of material was the stamp made out of? Why? Based on the explanation given by Nachman in the name of Rav Nachman in the name of Rabbi Barvo. If it's a material that your boss is going to flip out if you don't bring it home at the end of the day, because it's valuable, Well, even if it breaks off, the slave is going to have to carry it home. So let's just do the explanation now. Metal, even simple metal in those days was considered an item of value that you don't just relinquish and walk away. So if the thing is around the slave's neck, he'd never remove it. But what if it snaps and now it's broken and he can't wear it on his neck? He's going to carry it home because the boss will be very upset if he lost his metal, home, custom-made schmancy stamp or seal. But if it's made out of mud, you'll just make a new one tomorrow out of mud. So basically, when the seal was made out of metal, you're not allowed to wear it because if it breaks, you'll carry it. But if it's made out of mud and you'll lose it, your boss won't care. So then you're not going to end up carrying it home. Let me just recap one more time. One brisa says a slave can wear the stamp around the seal around the neck. One brisa says you cannot. The Gemara is looking to understand why it's not a contradiction. It seems to be a contradiction. Our present answer is, if it's made out of metal, you're not allowed to wear it. Because if it falls off, you'll carry it home, and you're not allowed to carry it. But if it's made out of mud, you'll just leave it on the ground, leave it where it is, make another one the next day.
Yeah, so if it's made out of mud, when it falls off, it'll probably break.
Especially because it probably broke. But if you read carefully in some of the commentaries in the Gemara, the indication is that the metal may have also broken. But still, it was valuable enough that you'd want to bring home the shards. How does metal crack? I don't know. But maybe those days it was a different kind of metal. It was more brittle. I don't know. Hachanami mistabra. And indeed, it makes sense. Why does it make sense? Because the same brisa that teaches us that you're not allowed to wear this thing around your neck also talks about the laws of purity, if you recall. We read this a few minutes ago. It says, the seals, whether it's on the neck or on the garment, does not become impure. Now let's put on our thinking cap, says the Gemara, and let's think about what kind of material we're likely talking. If we're talking about a seal, a badge made out of metal, then here's what the text is saying. Hani, the seal, does not become impure. But other vessels made out of metal certainly can become impure. The next line of the Gemara, which I'm going to skip because I want to read Rashi first. However, mud is never mikabel tuma. Not when you make it into a pot, when you make it into a bowl, when you make it into a baseball bat. It doesn't matter. It doesn't become impure. And therefore, we would never need to say that a mud item does not become impure. It's a given. The text, the ain mikabel tuma, indicates that other vessels made out of the same material would be mikabel tuma. Let's read Rashi. Mistap. The Mishel Mateches Kai. Why isn't it mikabel tuma? Why doesn't a seal for a slave, why can't it become impure? So we said it's not a vessel. Why is it not a vessel? Well, because it's not to beautify you. It's simply something that informs of ownership, and for the purposes of being considered a tachshit linoi, our Gemara does not see a metal stamp for a slave to be considered linoi. Maybe a badge that would show your chashuva status, maybe the badge that shows that you're a policeman, maybe that would be mikabel tuma based on this. I didn't say it is, but maybe based on Rashi's reasoning. But this item, this stamp, is not something that is for beauty. It's simply to notify everybody who his boss is. It might have had a phone. It might have had a phone number on it. You like, how am I driving? How am I behaving? Call my boss. Maybe. Rashi, Hani, Hudle Mikabel Tuma, Mishum Delav Kalim Ninu, because they're not considered a vessel for the halachic purposes of being able to become impure. Hashar Klei Mataches Mikablin, other metal stuff would become tamei. All right. Ella Iyamr Special Titanan, if you would say that the stamp, the seal was made out of mud or clay, earth, are you proposing that there's any clay vessel that becomes impure? We have a brisa that teaches us clearly vessels of stone, Vessels of dung. You want to have your chicken soup in a vessel of dung? And vessels of earth can either become impure minatayra or midivrei seifrim. Right? We can conclusively prove the brisa that restricts wearing the seal on your neck must be talking about a vessel made out of metal. Rashi klei galolim tzvi bakash asum keli. Basically, the animal remains that are turned into a vessel. Now, today that might sound kind of unappetizing, but it's a reminder of how affluent and blessed we are today, that even the simplest of people would not consider making a bowl for their chicken soup out of dung. I think that's a true commentary. All right, that concludes this next segment of our Gemara, the segment that started with Gufa, analyzing the text that spoke of the seal, the badge around the neck of a slave. Ultimately, if it's made out of metal, the slave cannot wear it because although he's not going to remove it intentionally, if it falls off and he can't wear it, he's going to carry it home because otherwise his boss will be mighty upset. Any questions or comments, or should we jump into the next discussion of the Gemara? To our Kohen Gadol we go. Alan, you were going to say something?
I just wondered why they dropped the bill. They don't talk about the bill anymore.
Oh, we didn't drop it. We're going to talk about it very soon.
Okay.
For remembering that. Amar Mar, are you ready for this? The brisa we just read also talks about bells. And it says that they may not wear a bell around their neck on Shabbos. But he may have a bell that's on his clothing. Excuse me. Let's see the Gemara, and then let's see if it answers your question. If you're saying that a bell is allowed to be on your clothing, why can't it be around your neck? Dilma mifsik v'asila is the concern that it's going to fall off and you'll carry it. So you should also be worried about a bell affixed to his clothing. Dilma mafsik v'asila that you might come and carry it. Hacha b'mayaskinon. See more answers. You know what we're talking about. Dimcha be'mumcha. Rashi. Let me see Rashi first. That it was woven. Sha'arak beged v'sulam yisrael. Rafuna b'rei Rav Yeshua, as Rafuna b'rei Rav Yeshua taught. Kol shu'arog loy gazru. When there is a weaving dynamic, it is not prohibited to be worn around on Shabbos. Rashi, let's explain. Although Rashi says you might be confused, because when we said kol shu'arog loy gazru, a woven item is not a problem. We understood it to be talking about a hairpiece. Rashi says ultimately, broadly speaking, where there's less of a concern about woven material and Shabbos. Mamar. Hold on a second. All right, let's hold on a little longer, and then I think we have the answer. If not, we'll come back. So, Amar Mar, the Brisa also comments about a bell as it pertains to animals. An animal may not go out with a seal on its neck, nor a seal in its garments, nor with a bell, nor with a bell on its clothing. And, by the way, these bells cannot become ritually impure. Gemara asks, is it really so that a bell does not become impure? Elsewhere it is taught that a bell is impure. But a bell that's on a door cannot become impure. Text continues, hold on tight. If it's a doorbell that was taken off the door and attached to your animal, it can now become impure, even though when it was attached to a door, it didn't. Shel behema v'asol ladelas, but if it was an animal bell and it was attached to a door, af al pi shechiver ladelas v'kava b'masmarim, even if the bell is now very strongly affixed to the door, it can still remain tamei as it had been previously. Shekol hakelim yardim leidu tumasam b'machshava, any vessel which is presently incapable of becoming impure because of its previous use, by machshava alone, by considering it to be used for a function that can become virtually impure, it does then become impure. But it does not become unimpure. It doesn't come back pure unless you actually do something to change it substantively, as we discussed previously in the Gemara. So we have a contradiction, and this, I think, will give us a half answer to your question. On one hand, we said that the bell is impure. On the other hand, we said the bell is not impure. Loi kasha. Had is lay in bal. When can it become impure? When it has a inbal, a clap or a tongue. Had the last be inbal. But in our Gemara, where it says that these bells do not become ritually impure, we're talking about it doesn't have an inbal. It does not have a tongue. It doesn't actually make noise. It's there more for appearance. So I think this might answer at least partially Reb Allen's question, because it sounds like we're saying that they can't become impure because it doesn't have a bell, which means that the bells that we're talking about here that are worn by your staff might also not have a bell and might not be making music, which might answer your question. Now, I want to find another answer. I want to say something, but I'd be more comfortable if I didn't make it up. So give me a second.
If it's a bell without a clapper, it's not a bell.
If you look at it, you'd see it as a. I'm not sure if that is true. I mean, functionally, a bell is a bell that makes noise, but I think you can have something that's called a bell even if it doesn't have a clapper. Anyone? Tell me some more. Isabel. Is that the Milshin or? More seconds, and then we're going to continue. This might have to go on Dr. Hammer's list.
In those days, they weren't even supposed to wear eyeglasses.
In those days, they didn't own eyeglasses because eyeglasses were not invented, to my knowledge, in the time of the Gemara. Unless, did we once just find out that they actually did have eyeglasses? I'd be shocked.
It was written in the Chayenu. It's one of Rambam's laws.
That what?
That you can't wear eyeglasses on Shabbos.
Are you sure?
I just read it in the Rambam.
Very interesting.
Page 179. Page 179.
Do you have it available?
Last edition.
Do you have it available for yourself right now?
I just gave it back to the shul.
I
dropped it off.
Interesting, because I like to check that out.
Giving it back to the shul is one of Rambam's laws also.
But I had an explanation for that. because the law was changed. The halacha was changed.
Why did that? And tell us, why did the halacha change? What changed?
Because in those days,
Oh,
they didn't have real eyeglasses. They were.
it was more like
They didn't have frames. They didn't have frames, so the eyeglass kept falling off.
What do you call the monocles or something, like where you hold it up?
Yeah, that's right.
But
So you had to hold them, and then they might have dropped.
Also, today our relationship with glasses are such that many people.
I think Benjamin Franklin is noted for inventing eyeglasses.
Really? So today, long story short, today we can't really function, many of us, without glasses. I'm privileged for whatever reason. I never started wearing glasses, but
Benjamin Franklin, I think, invented bifocal.
So contact lenses would be less of a problem.
probably
In
unless
those days, I wouldn't stick anything in my eyes.
No. All right, we're gonna move on. We'll have to see. It's possible that the fact that they were making noise would not be a problem, because it wasn't the owner himself making it, and it wasn't for the benefit of the owner, unless you say it is because people should know it belongs to the slave. So we have to do a little research to find out exactly what the deal with the bells. Rabbi Allen, it's a good question. The easy answer would be that the Gemara seems to indicate that there wasn't making noise, but I want to grant you that there's more there that needs to be researched. So let's.
Yeah, Benjamin Franklin invented the bifocals. The glasses go to the back.
Let's Google this real fast before we continue. Maybe that's a little off topic. When were eyeglasses? You see, I'm not the first person to ask this question. Google predicted it. 13th century. The first wearable glasses known to history appeared in Italy in the 13th century. Primitive glass-blown lenses were set in wooden or leather frames. They held before the eye or perched on the nose. This is, I think, what we typically envision as eyeglasses. This guy, right?
Oh.
Or this guy. If anyone owns something that looks like this, don't throw it out. All right, it looks like Italy gets a lot of credit. The idea may have started.
Yeah, someone says even further back than that. Wow.
Yeah.
It's 1000 BC.
That's the headline. Where did it say that? I saw that too, but I'm looking for the actual text.
Here it is.
Further up.
You guys have, if someone was able to read that, you guys have very good eyesight. Here. Archaeologists, documents relating to optical themed works. Obviously, human vision began being degraded before the modern era. But it is curious to see the history of eyeglasses, which is why I was curious to see if you could remind me the exact wording of the Rambam. I'll have to look it up. All right. Gemara asks, if it is considered a keli, afalpi de lesle inbal, then it should be a problem even if it does not have a clapper. Ilav manahu, but if it's not considered a vessel inbal mashveli mana, you think just a little clapper makes it a bell? Rashi, tachshet chashiv, if it's a thing that makes you look nice, because apparently that's really what the bell was about. It wasn't really about the sound. It was a certain style. So then who needs the inbal? Mishum inbal mi hametachshet. The Gemara answers yes. Actually, the clapper makes all the difference in the world. Rashi, inbal mashvele mana. The clapper makes it a vessel, a keli. V'lo mishum tachshet al mishum keli. It doesn't turn it into an adornment, but it turns it into a functioning vessel, keli, tool. Kid Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonasan. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonasan, as was taught by this Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. Minayin lemashmiya kol bekli mataches. Shehu tamei. How do you know that a instrument that makes noise becomes ritually impure or becomes susceptible to ritual impurity? Shenemar kol davar asher yavoid ha'esh taviru Ba'esh. Kol davar. Every davar that comes into fire needs to be purified by fire. Afilu dibor yavai ba'esh. Even if its function is dibor, it's sound. Let's see how Rabbi Steinsaltz translate this, because this is a play on words on the word davar. The sages interpret the verse homiletically. Every davar, thing, even speech, dibor, even a sound-making item has to be purified in fire, which means that it's susceptible to ritual impurity. So the Gemara says, "B'mayu kimtad b'lesli inval." Why do you assume that the brisa that says that it's pure does not have an inval? Ema mitziyosa. You still have another half of the text that says, "V'loy b'zuk shebetzavarai, aval yoytzehu b'zuk shebeksusai." Zeva zeh mekabel tuma. We have the next part of the brisa that talks about a difference between the bell being on the clothing or around the neck. Why don't we just check if there's a clapper? If it doesn't have a tongue, how could it ever be susceptible to tuma that you're going to start distinguishing between if it's hung or if it's attached to the garments? Vitamino. We seem to have a contradiction. I'm going fast. I want to recap. I want to end a subject, and I'll give you a recap before. Ramino, there's an apparent contradiction from this text that says, "Ha'isa zoigin limachteshes." If you make a bell for a mortar, Rashi, apparently, in the ancient times, it was understood that when you crush the spice, if it makes a good noise, the vibration of the noise is actually advantageous for the processing of the spices. So they would have a bell attached to it. Let me see if Rabbi Steinsaltz has any notes here. He should. Hold on. Oh, here. No, that's all. All right, let's see. Anyways, we have a brisa that says that if you have a bell attached to this, to the mortar, ula arisa, and for a cradle. Why would you have a bell on a cradle? It was used to wake up the child. As well as for the covering, the shmata that's on books. Okay, probably the word is not shmata. Okay, here it sounds like we're talking actually not about a book. We're talking about the mantle of a Sefer Torah. When they would carry the Torah, I take that back a third time. Maybe it's not a Sefer Torah. It looks like they'd have a book, and the book would have a bell. And when the Rebbe would come to Cheder and carry his Sefer, it would ring, and the children would be called. Let's see how Rabbi Steinsaltz translates it. No, he says Torah scrolls. Okay. And similarly for the covering, the children's clothing, all of these bells, yesh lahem imbal tmeim. If it has a bell, if it has a clapper, it's fine. Ein lam imbal tahir. If it doesn't have a clapper, it's tar. Nitlu in belehem. What if it used to have a bell? What if it used to have a clapper and you took it off? Adayin tumasan aleim. It still remains impure. If it already became impure, removing the clapper won't make it ritually pure. So what's the contradiction? Apparently, even with regards to bells used by people, it is the clapper that makes it impure or not, which is a problem over here because we seem to say that only with animals there's a distinction of a clapper or not, but with a human it would always be mekabel tuma. But here it sounds like they always need to have a clapper. So the Gemara answers, no, you're right. Hani mili b'tinik. A bell is considered a keli only if it has a clapper when it's worn by a child. Because a child only wears the bell to make noise. But when an adult wears it, but an adult could be a fashion statement, and therefore it could be mekabel tuma even if there is no bell. So let's recap this last Gemara, and then we'll go recap from the top. We introduced a brisa. The brisa was introduced for another matter. It was introduced to talk about the seals or the badges around the neck. But once we introduce the brisa, we talk about the fact that a bell could be mekabel tuma. It could become ritually impure, and it could be not ritually impure. And so we try to figure out why sometimes is a bell ritually impure and sometimes not ritually impure. So initially we said the distinction is if it's meant for a human or if it's meant for an animal. For an animal, it's never mekabel tuma because it's not attached. But then we brought another brisa that indicates that a bell can be ritually impure for a human even if it has no clapper. So the Gemara, long story short, the Gemara answers like this. A bell could have two functions. It could be a keli. It could be a tachshit for a human. It could be an adornment, and it could be a vessel that has a function. So one item, a bell, could be perceived in the halachic eyes in two perspectives. Either as a decoration or as something that has a function. Typically, when it comes to animals, doors, pestles, and children, or mortars and children, the function of this bell is not beauty, not fashion, but function. What was the function? The noise it makes. If it doesn't make noise, it's not considered a bell, and it's not ritually impure. It's not a keli. When it comes to humans, it's a little more complicated because there are two types of humans. There's little humans and big humans. Little humans wear bells because you want to hear the kids wherever they go so that they don't get into trouble and you can track them. Big humans would wear a bell, assuming they would, because it was part of the latest fashion. So by humans, adults, a bell is considered fashion. Tachshit. A tachshit, whether it has the in-ball or not, it's a tachshit. It makes you look nice if you think it makes you look nice. So that's the bottom line of our Gemara here. There's different functions, and depending on there's different values of a bell. Depending what the value is would depend how important the clapper is. That's the bottom line. Our Gemara. And this concludes our little discussion here. We're going to have a little more bell talk. Actually, just the brief bell talk. Then we're going to start talking about scissors and razors and other kinds of interesting stuff. Let's go to the top and then we'll call it a day. Today's Gemara introduced us with the words gufa. We took a look at a text that was introduced parenthetically yesterday. It was the text about these seals or stamps worn around the neck. And we said that a slave can wear it on their can wear it on their neck and not on their clothing. We had another brisa that says they can wear it neither way. And after a lengthy discussion, the Gemara determines that it depends what material it's made out of. If it's made out of metal, if you drop it, you're going to have to carry it back home. Therefore, you shouldn't wear it on Shabbas. If it's made out of clay, mud, then your boss doesn't want you to bring back the shards. If it breaks, you go home without it. And then the next day, you'll get a new one. Which allowed us to introduce a brisa that talks about the fact that there's all different kinds of vessels made of earth and stone, and they're never mekabel tuma. By the way, if you're at all curious or follow Israel archaeology, it is known that there's a large proliferation of chalk vessels. This is what they refer, I believe, to clay avonim. And why are they so prevalent in Second Temple era? It has to do with the laws of impurity and purity. Such a keli can't become ritually impure. And just like they find a lot of mikvahs in Eretz Yisrael, especially from the Second Temple era, they find a lot of these stone vessels for that very same function. Google it, you'll see it's true. Especially if you follow the academic articles about archaeology, there's frequent reference. And many times finding those vessels can be an indication of who lived there, that it was Jews that were concerned about ritual impurity, because the Romans were more into the style than the Tahara matter. The Gemara then goes on to talk about the bells. We have a little bit of an outstanding question from Rabbi Allen, although I think we have the answer, but it deserves a little more attention. And the question about the bell was, can you wear a bell around your neck or not? The Brisa says you're not allowed to, and we said the concern is that it might fall off, you might carry it. And the reason why we're not concerned when it's connected to a garment is because it's woven in. According to Rashi, we have a gzeira or not a gzeira. Chachamim established that it's not a problem. According to Tosfos, I know he didn't read this the first time. I believe no, seems like Tosfos, unless we'll read again, is agreeing with Rashi that basically the Chachamim are not concerned about woven wear. Then we talked about the deal with the bell, and that's where we just gave the shortened version. Depends what the bell is used for. If the bell is makabel, again, we talked not only about the laws of Shabbos and a bell, we talked about the fact that it's makabel tuma, that it becomes impure, and we started talking about if it does have a tongue or not, if it does have an in bell or not. Long story short, when it's meant to make noise, it won't be considered a keli without, but if it's meant for a tachshit, you don't need the bell, and that really is a condensed version of today's Gemara. I would like to thank everyone, our dear friends here, for joining us today for a slightly complicated study of Gemara. I hope it brings a lot of blessing to everybody here, your families, all of Klal Yisrael. We'll mention the name, Aaron ben Moshe, and prayers for good news for across the globe. And Atzlacha Rabbah to Dr. Hammer's Shul's new rabbi. Should be
from Sharei Shemayim, by the way, Bernie.
Oh, he's leaving Sharei Shemayim of Toronto.
He couldn't have been there very long.
No, he is there long.
No, because that was